I've been a 911 dispatcher for 10 years. Last night, I got a call which made me quit forever. The call came in at 2:43 a.m. on a Thursday, which should have been my first warning because nothing good ever happens at 2:43 a.m. I'd been working the overnight shift at the County Emergency Dispatch Center for a decade, and I'd developed an instinct for calls that would ruin your night versus calls that would ruin your life. This one felt different the moment the line connected, not because of what was said, but because of what I heard in the background. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. No ambient noise, no breathing, no static, just a void that felt like it was pulling sound into itself rather than transmitting it. Then a voice, elderly and male, with the kind of gentle politeness that reminded me of my grandfather before dementia took him. "Hello, dear. I'm terribly sorry to bother you at this hour, but I need to report that I've died. Could you send someone to collect my body? I'm at 1847 Rosewood Lane, and I'm afraid I'm making quite a mess on the carpet." The words were so matter-of-fact, delivered with such apologetic courtesy, that my brain took a full 3 seconds to process what he'd actually said. I'm trained for panic, for confusion, for people who can barely speak through their terror. I'm not trained for someone calmly reporting their own death like they're calling about a missed trash pickup. My first thought was dementia, or a confused elderly person having some kind of mental health crisis, which happens more often than people realize. I'd taken dozens of calls from older folks who'd gotten disoriented or were experiencing delusions, and the protocol was always the same: stay calm, speak clearly, send medical assistance. I kept my voice steady and professional, the tone I'd perfected over thousands of calls. "Sir, this is 911 Emergency Services. Can you tell me your name and describe what's happening? Are you injured? Are you having trouble breathing?" There was a pause, and I could hear what sounded like a gentle sigh, the kind someone makes when they're trying to be patient with someone who isn't understanding. "My name was Harold Finch, dear. And no, I'm not having trouble breathing because I'm not breathing at all anymore. I had a heart attack approximately 40 minutes ago while watching the evening news, and I've been sitting here in my armchair ever since, wondering if I should call. I know you're terribly busy, but someone really should come collect me before I start to smell." The way he said it, so practical and considerate, made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't articulate. I glanced at my screen, checking the call origin data that usually populated automatically, but the location field was blank, just showing unknown where the address should have been. I tried a different approach, thinking maybe this was an elaborate prank call from someone with too much time and a dark sense of humor. "Mr. Finch, I need you to tell me if you're experiencing any pain or discomfort right now. Can you describe your physical condition?" Another pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again, there was something almost amused in his tone. "Well, I suppose physically I'm quite stiff, which is to be expected given the circumstances. My left arm is still clutching the remote control, though I can't seem to let go of it now. There's a rather unpleasant smell starting to develop, and I believe my cat, Whiskers, has been nibbling on my ankle, though I can't say I blame her since I forgot to fill her food bowl before I died. Is that the sort of physical description you need?" I felt my stomach turn over, because the details were too specific, too matter-of-fact to be a prank. Pranksters usually go for shock value or try to get a reaction. They don't provide mundane details about pet feeding schedules and furniture positioning. I pulled up the address database and typed in 1847 Rosewood Lane, which immediately populated with resident information. Harold Finch, age 73, widower, no emergency contacts listed, no previous 911 calls from this address in the system history. "Mr. Finch, I'm sending police and emergency medical services to your address right now. I need you to stay on the line with me until they arrive. Can you do that?" I'd already flagged the call for immediate dispatch, sending units to the address with a note about possible mental health crisis and welfare check needed. The response should have been immediate, patrol cars redirecting to the location, but my screen showed an error message I'd never seen before. Location verification failed. Unable to route emergency services. I stared at the message, trying to understand what it meant, because in 10 years of dispatching, I'd never seen the system simply refuse to send help. Harold's voice came back through my headset, still patient, still apologetic. "Oh, I'm afraid I can't stay on the line much longer, dear. There are others waiting to call, and it wouldn't be fair to monopolize your time. But I did want to make sure someone knew about my body. My daughter lives in California, and I'd hate for her to fly back and find me like this. The spare key is under the ceramic frog by the front door, if that helps your officers get inside. Thank you so much for your assistance." Then the line went dead, just clicked off, and my screen showed the call had lasted exactly 3 minutes and 17 seconds. I sat there staring at my console, trying to process what had just happened. The rational part of my brain said this was a prank, or a confused elderly man who wasn't actually dead, but something deeper and more instinctive was screaming that I'd just experienced something fundamentally wrong. I manually entered the address into the dispatch system, bypassing the automatic routing, and sent a welfare check request with high priority. 2 patrol units acknowledged and confirmed they were en route. Estimated arrival in 8 minutes. I logged the call details and flagged it for supervisor review, typing out a summary that sounded insane even as I wrote it. Caller reported his own death, provided specific details, Call terminated before EMS could be routed. Resident name matches address database. Request immediate welfare check and possible mental health evaluation. My supervisor, Linda Kovac, appeared behind my station within 2 minutes, reading over my shoulder. You wrote that a dead man called 911? Her tone wasn't accusatory, just confused, and I explained as best I could about the call's content and the strange system error that had prevented normal routing. Linda had been supervising dispatch for 20 years, and she'd seen everything from hoax bomb threats to actual hostage situations, but she looked genuinely puzzled by this one. Pull up the call recording, she said, leaning closer to my screen. Let's hear exactly what this guy said. I queued up the audio file, expecting to hear Harold's polite, apologetic voice explaining his death, but what came through the speakers made both of us freeze. The recording was there, showing the correct timestamp and duration, but the audio was just silence. Not static or corruption, just complete absence of sound for 3 minutes and 17 seconds, then the call termination tone. Linda and I looked at each other, and I saw my own confusion reflected in her expression. That's not possible, I said, because I'd heard every word Harold spoke, had noted details about his cat and his remote control and the ceramic frog. The system records every call automatically. There has to be audio. Linda checked the file properties and system logs, confirming that the recording hardware had been functioning normally, that other calls before and after mine had recorded properly. My call, specifically, had somehow produced a perfect silence, despite me clearly hearing and responding to a caller. Linda suggested maybe it was a phone system glitch, that perhaps I'd heard Harold's voice through some kind of crossed line or feedback loop, while the recording system captured nothing. It didn't make sense, but neither did any other explanation. The radio crackled with traffic from the patrol units approaching Rosewood Lane, and Linda and I both turned our attention to the response. Officer Donnelly came through first. Dispatch, we're at 1847 Rosewood. Residential neighborhood, single-family home, lights are off inside. No vehicles in driveway, checking perimeter now. There was a pause while they presumably walked around the property. Then Donnelly again. Dispatch, we've got a visual through the front window. Subject appears to be deceased in a chair. Forced entry required for welfare check. Requesting EMS on standby. My heart sank, even though part of me had expected this confirmation. Linda keyed her mic and authorized the entry, simultaneously dispatching an ambulance and notifying the medical examiner's office. Officer Donnelly provided updates as they entered the residence, and every detail matched what Harold had told me. Elderly male in an armchair, clutching a TV remote, signs of cardiac arrest. Dead for approximately 2 to 3 hours based on body temperature and rigor mortis. They even found the cat, Whiskers, and mentioned she'd been trying to wake her owner by pawing at his leg. The officers secured the scene and waited for the medical examiner, and Linda released me to take a break while they processed everything. I walked to the break room feeling like I'd left part of my sanity back at my console, poured coffee I didn't want, and tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe Harold had called 911 before his heart attack, confused and disoriented, and the timing had just been coincidental. Maybe I'd misheard his words, my tired brain filling in details that hadn't actually been spoken. Maybe the silent recording was proof that I'd hallucinated the entire conversation, some kind of stress-induced auditory hallucination that felt real but wasn't. None of these explanations satisfied me, but they were better than accepting that I'd received a phone call from a dead man who'd accurately reported his own death from beyond whatever came after. I sat in that break room for 30 minutes, watching the clock tick toward 4 a.m., before forcing myself to return to my station. Linda had already moved on to other supervisory duties, and the overnight shift was winding down toward the morning changeover when things would get busier with traffic accidents and domestic incidents. I logged back into my console, checked the pending calls queue, and tried to pretend this was just another night in a decade of strange nights. Then my phone rang again at 4:37 a.m., and this time the caller was a woman, middle-aged by the sound of her voice, speaking with the same eerily polite tone Harold had used. Yes, hello, I'm so sorry to disturb you, but I need to report that I've died. Heart attack, I'm afraid. I'm on my kitchen floor at 2334 Elmwood Avenue, and I'm worried my pills have spilled everywhere. Someone might slip on them if they're not careful. I felt my blood turn to ice because this couldn't be coincidence. Couldn't be two confused elderly people using the exact same phrasing and manner to report their deaths. I tried to respond, tried to ask her name and condition, but my voice came out shaky and uncertain. Ma'am, can you tell me your name? Are you able to move or check your pulse? The woman, patient and kind, responded like she was explaining something simple to a child. My name was Dorothy Walsh, dear. And no, I'm quite past checking my pulse. I died about an hour ago, but I only just got through to you. The line was busy, I suppose. Could you let my son know? His number is in my address book by the phone. He'll be devastated, but someone needs to feed my birds. She gave me specific instructions about where her son's contact information was located, about her medication schedule that would need to be canceled, about practical concerns that only someone planning for their death would think about. I was already typing the address into my system, my hands trembling so badly I had to retype it twice. 2334. Elmwood Avenue populated with resident information. Dorothy Walsh, age 68, widow, One adult child listed as emergency contact. I sent units immediately, not waiting for the call to end, not bothering with protocols about keeping callers on the line. Dorothy seemed to sense my urgency and spoke faster, trying to convey as much information as possible before our time ran out. Oh, and dear, the others are waiting to call. There are quite a few tonight. They asked me to tell you that they're sorry for the inconvenience, but the system only allows us one call after. We have to use it wisely. The line went dead before I could ask what she meant by others, or the system, or one call after. My recording for this call was also silent. 2 minutes and 43 seconds of nothing captured, while I'd clearly heard every word Dorothy spoke. I sat frozen at my console, watching my screen show Dorothy's call as a completed transaction with no audio content, and I realized with growing horror that this wasn't going to stop. That whatever was happening, I was somehow tuned into something that wasn't supposed to be accessible to the living. Officer Ramirez confirmed Dorothy's death 15 minutes later, found on her kitchen floor exactly as she'd described, pills scattered across the tile, birds chirping in their cage by the window. Time of death estimated at 3:30 a.m., approximately 1 hour before my call. The medical examiner noted cardiac arrest, same as Harold, same as what Dorothy had reported herself. Linda came back to my station after the second confirmation, her expression no longer confused, but actively concerned. 2 calls, same scenario, both confirmed deceased before they called. And both recordings are silent? She was trying to find a logical explanation, some technical glitch that would make sense of this, but we both knew there wasn't one. Maybe it's a hack, she suggested without conviction. Someone accessing our system remotely, spoofing calls from these addresses after the deaths occurred, trying to mess with us. It didn't explain how the callers knew details that hadn't been publicly reported, didn't explain the specific knowledge about pets and medication and spare keys. It definitely didn't explain why I could hear them perfectly while the system captured nothing. The third call came at 5:12 a.m., and this time it was a teenager, male, voice cracking with youth and uncertainty. Hey, this is really weird, but I think I'm dead. Car accident on Route 9, near the old quarry. I was texting while driving, which was stupid, I know. Can you, tell my mom I'm sorry? And that I love her? She's going to be so mad at me. His tone was different from Harold's formal politeness or Dorothy's maternal concern. He sounded confused, scared, like he hadn't fully processed what had happened to him. I tried to engage him, tried to get more information, but he was rambling about his last moments, about seeing his phone fly from his hands, about the tree that seemed to appear out of nowhere. I don't know how I'm calling you right now. They said I could make one call, and I picked 911 because maybe you could, send someone to help, but I guess there's no helping me anymore. Just please tell my mom I'm sorry. His voice broke on the last word, and then the line disconnected, leaving me with another silent recording and a growing sense that I was losing my grip on reality. The teenager's name was Austin Reeves, age 17. And his body was found in his car wrapped around a tree on Route 9 within 20 minutes of my call. Time of death estimated at 4:45 a.m., about 30 minutes before he'd called me. I counted 4 more calls over the next hour as my shift crawled toward its 7 a.m. end. An elderly woman who died in her sleep and wanted to make sure her diabetes medication was removed from the house so her grandchildren wouldn't accidentally take it. A middle-aged man who'd had a stroke and was concerned about his dogs being trapped in the backyard. A young mother who died from complications of an undiagnosed condition and needed someone to pick up her daughter from daycare later, and a construction worker who'd fallen from scaffolding and wanted his crew to know the accident wasn't their fault. Every single caller was polite, apologetic, focused on practical concerns and the welfare of those they'd left behind. Every single call was confirmed as legitimate, with bodies found exactly where described, deaths occurring before the calls were placed, and every single recording was silent, showing only the duration of calls that I'd clearly heard and responded to. By the time my replacement arrived for the morning shift, I'd stopped trying to rationalize what was happening and had moved into a state of numb acceptance that bordered on dissociation. I logged out of my console, handed over my headset to the incoming dispatcher, and walked out of the building into the gray dawn light without speaking to anyone. I drove home in silence, my phone turned off, trying to process the impossibility of the last few hours. I'd been a 911 dispatcher for 10 years, had taken thousands of calls, had heard people in every state of crisis imaginable. I'd guided people through CPR on dying relatives, talked down suicidal teenagers, coordinated responses to violent crimes in progress. I thought I'd heard everything a human voice could convey through a phone line, every shade of panic and fear and desperation, but I'd never heard what I heard that night. The voices of the dead, calling to report their own passings with the same calm efficiency they'd probably use to schedule dentist appointments or return library books. The ordinariness of it was somehow worse than if they'd been screaming or begging or incoherent. These were people who'd accepted what had happened to them and were now trying to minimize the inconvenience their deaths would cause for the living. I got home, locked my door, and stood in my kitchen trying to decide if I should sleep or call my own therapist or just quit and never go back. The decision was made for me when my personal cell phone rang at 9:30 a.m., waking me from a fitful 2-hour nap. I'd forgotten to turn it back on, so the call had gone to voicemail, and when I checked the message, my father's voice came through the speaker. "Hey, sweetie, I finally got through. I've been trying to call you for 3 years." My father had died suddenly from an aneurysm 3 years ago, during my shift, while I was at work dispatching emergencies for strangers. I'd gotten the call from the hospital after he was already gone, had never gotten to say goodbye, had carried that guilt for years, and now his voice was on my voicemail, sounding exactly like he always had, warm and slightly amused. "I know this is going to sound crazy, but I'm okay. I'm actually really okay. It's weird here, but not bad. They explained to me about the phone system, about how we each get one call after we cross over. I tried calling you right away, but you weren't ready to hear it yet. Nobody is, really. The system knows, somehow. It only connects calls when the living person is ready to receive them, when they're in a state where they can actually hear us, instead of just dismissing it as impossible." He paused, and I could hear background sounds that weren't quite sounds, more like the memory of sounds, echoes of conversation and movement that didn't translate properly through the phone connection. "I wanted to use my call to tell you I'm proud of you, and that what happened wasn't your fault. You couldn't have saved me. Nobody could have. But I also wanted to warn you about something, sweetie. The line, the 911 system, it wasn't originally designed for emergencies in the way you think. It was designed as a bridge, a way for souls to communicate one last time with the living world before fully transitioning. The emergency use, the living calling for help, that came later. It's like we hijacked the system for our own purposes, but the original function is still there, running underneath everything. And lately, there's been a problem." His tone shifted, becoming more serious, more urgent. "The calls are increasing. More souls are trying to reach back, to communicate with the living, because something is changing on this side. The boundaries are getting thinner, and the entities that manage the transition, the ones who used to carefully control when and how calls could be made, they're losing control. Souls are calling who shouldn't be able to call, who should have moved on already. And they're not just reporting deaths anymore. They're warning about what's coming." The message continued, my father's voice explaining things that my rational mind wanted to reject, but some deeper part of me recognized as truth. He told me that every 911 call center had at least one dispatcher who could hear the dead calls, who served as an anchor point for souls trying to communicate. Most dispatchers never realized what they were hearing, dismissing the calls as pranks or glitches, or the product of their own stress and exhaustion. But occasionally, someone like me would become fully aware, would understand what they were listening to, and would have to make a choice about what to do with that knowledge. The entities, the ones who answer when we get here, they call themselves operators. They're not angels or demons, just something else. Something that exists to facilitate transitions between states of being. They've been doing this since the first human learned to cry out for help, long before there were phones or technology. The 911 system, with its 3 numbers and its specific purpose, it created a perfect conduit for their work. It gave them a framework to operate within, a recognizable pattern that both the living and the dead could understand and use. My father's voice grew quieter, more strained, like he was running out of time or energy to maintain the connection. But the operators are worried now, because the calls are coming from souls who died wrong, violently or suddenly, or with unfinished business that's keeping them tethered to the living world. And these souls are trying to warn the living about what they're seeing from their side, about patterns and connections that are visible only after death. They're calling to report not just their own deaths, but deaths that haven't happened yet, crimes that are being planned, disasters that are approaching. The system wasn't designed for precognition or prevention, only for reporting what had already occurred. And the strain of all these calls, all these souls trying to push information backward through time, it's starting to break the infrastructure that keeps the living world separate from the dead one. He paused again, and I could hear what sounded like interference or static, but underneath it, voices, dozens or hundreds of voices all trying to speak at once. "They're going to keep calling you, sweetie. Souls who need to be heard, who have warnings or messages, or just need someone to acknowledge their existence one final time. And you need to decide if you're going to keep answering, knowing what the calls really are, or if you're going to walk away and let someone else carry this burden." The voicemail ended, showing a timestamp of 9:28 a.m., 2 minutes of my father's voice explaining the impossible. I played it again immediately, needing to hear his words a second time, but the audio was gone, replaced by that same perfect silence that had characterized all the dead calls from my shift. The system had allowed me to hear his message once, had given me the information I needed, and then had erased the evidence, like it had never existed. I sat on my couch holding my phone, trying to understand the magnitude of what I'd learned. The 911 system, the infrastructure that society relied on to connect people in crisis with help, was actually something far older and stranger, a bridge between the living and the dead that humanity had accidentally created when we gave emergency services a universal number and a specific purpose. Every time someone dialed 911, they were tapping into a network that existed on multiple planes of reality, connecting not just to dispatchers and emergency services, but to something that transcended normal space and time. I thought about all the calls I'd taken over the past decade, wondering how many had actually been from the dead without me realizing it. How many times had I heard voices reporting deaths that had already happened, dismissed them as confused or pranking, sent units to addresses where bodies were found exactly as described? How many warning calls had I missed because I wasn't listening properly, wasn't tuned into the frequency that the dead were using to communicate? The guilt was overwhelming, thinking about all the messages I'd failed to receive, all the warnings that had gone unheeded because I was too focused on living emergencies to recognize the dead ones. My phone rang again at 2 p.m., pulling me out of my spiraling thoughts. The caller ID showed unknown number, and I knew before answering that this would be another call from someone who'd crossed over. I let it ring 3 times while I debated answering, knowing that once I truly acknowledged what these calls were, there would be no going back to normal dispatching, no way to unhear what I'd learned. On the 4th ring, I answered, and a child's voice came through, young, maybe 7 or 8 years old, speaking with that same eerie calm I'd come to recognize. "Hello, I'm calling to report that I'm in the lake. The man said I could make one phone call, so I picked 911. I've been in the water for a long time, I think. It's very cold and very dark, and I can't remember how I got here. Can you help me?" The child's words were spoken without panic or fear, just confusion and a desire for assistance. I felt my throat close up, because this wasn't just a death report. This was something worse. A child who died in circumstances that sounded suspicious, possibly criminal. "Sweetie, can you tell me your name? Do you remember what happened before you went into the water?" The child thought for a moment, and I could hear that strange background noise again, the echo of sounds that weren't quite sounds. "My name is Sophie, I think. Or it was Sophie. The man at the park had a dog, and he said I could pet it if I came to his van. Mommy always said not to go with strangers, but the dog was so pretty, and he seemed nice. Then everything went dark and cold, and now I'm in the lake. Can you tell my mommy I'm sorry I broke the rule? She's going to be very worried." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone, because this wasn't just a death report. This was a child murder victim trying to provide information about her killer. "Sophie, this is very important. Can you remember anything about the man or the van? What the dog looked like? Where the park was?" I was trying to get details that could be used to find her body, to identify her killer, but Sophie was already moving on to other concerns. "The dog was brown and fluffy. The van was white with pictures on the side, but I don't remember what kind of pictures. The park was near my school, I think, but that was a long time ago. The man said I have to go soon, that I've used up my call time. Can you please tell my mommy I love her, and that I'm not scared anymore?" It was scary at first, but now it's okay. The operators are nice. They help you understand what happened. The line disconnected, leaving me with another silent recording and information about what was clearly a child abduction and murder. I immediately called Linda, breaking every protocol about maintaining caller confidentiality, because this was bigger than dispatch procedures. I explained about Sophie's call, about the details she'd provided, about the pattern of calls I'd been receiving from the dead. Linda listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was silent for a long time before speaking. "I believe you," she said finally, her voice heavy with implications I couldn't fully parse. "I've been supervising dispatch for 20 years, and I've seen things I couldn't explain. Calls that shouldn't have been possible. Information that callers couldn't have known. Coincidences that stretched probability beyond breaking. I always assumed it was just the stress of the job, the weird things that happen when you're dealing with life and death situations constantly. But if what you're telling me is true, if the system is actually connecting us to the dead, then we need to figure out what to do with that information." We spent the next 2 hours on the phone, Linda researching missing children in our area, while I tried to remember every detail Sophie had provided. We found her. Sophie Brennan, age 7, reported missing 15 years ago from a park near her elementary school. Never found, case went cold despite extensive searches, family still holding vigils every year on the anniversary of her disappearance. The details matched what Sophie had told me, the timing, the location, even the description of a white van that had been reported by witnesses, but never located. Linda contacted the detective who'd originally worked the case, now retired, and explained that new information had come to light through an anonymous tip. The detective, Thomas Wickham, was skeptical, but interested enough to listen. Linda fed him Sophie's details without explaining their source, and I could hear his reaction even through Linda's phone, the sharp intake of breath, the sudden intensity in his questions. Where did this information come from? That detail about the brown dog that was never released to the public. Only the family and investigating officers knew the girl had mentioned a dog right before she disappeared. Linda made up something about a confidential informant and protected sources, and Wickham said he'd follow up, that he still had connections in the department who might be willing to reopen the case based on new leads. After hanging up with the detective, Linda and I sat in silence, both processing the implications. If Sophie's call was legitimate, if dead people could provide information about unsolved crimes, then every cold case, every missing person, every mysterious death could potentially be solved by dispatchers who could hear the right frequency. But it also meant that dispatchers like me would become targets for every grieving family, Every conspiracy theorist, every person desperate for closure or revenge. The weight of that responsibility felt crushing, knowing that I had access to information that could bring justice or peace, but also knowing the personal cost of becoming that kind of conduit. My phone didn't stop ringing for the next 18 hours. Call after call from the dead, each with their own story, their own concerns, their own messages for the living. An elderly man who'd been murdered by his caretaker and wanted someone to check on his hidden savings so his family could inherit. A suicide victim who wanted to apologize to her children for leaving them. A soldier who died overseas and needed someone to deliver a message to his wife about where he'd hidden important documents. A homeless man who'd frozen to death and wanted someone to know he'd existed, that his life had mattered, even if society had discarded him. Each call was heartbreaking in its own way, each voice carrying the weight of unfinished business and the desperation of having only one chance to communicate. I took notes on every call, documented details, tried to figure out how to help souls that were beyond any help I could actually provide. Some calls I could action, contacting authorities or family members with information that came from anonymous tips. Others I could only listen to, bearing witness to the final words of people who needed to be heard, even if their messages couldn't be delivered. By the time I dragged myself back to work for my next scheduled shift, I'd made my decision. I couldn't continue being a normal 911 dispatcher, taking calls from the living while also receiving calls from the dead, trying to maintain the fiction that these were separate systems with separate purposes. The strain of operating on both frequencies simultaneously was already showing in physical symptoms: exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure, headaches that felt like my skull was trying to contain too much information, a constant ringing in my ears that was probably tinnitus, but felt more like the residual echo of all those voices trying to push through the barrier between worlds. I met with Linda in her office before my shift started and told her I was resigning, effective immediately. She didn't argue or try to talk me out of it, just nodded with an expression that suggested she'd been expecting this. "I wondered how long you'd last once you could hear them clearly," she said, pulling out a folder from her desk drawer. "Every dispatcher who becomes fully aware faces the same choice. Most quit within days, unable to handle the psychological burden. A few stay and try to help both the living and the dead, but they usually burn out within months. The ones who last longest are the ones who find a way to help without being consumed by it." Linda handed me the folder, which contained information about a private organization called the Threshold Foundation, funded by families of missing persons and unsolved crime victims, dedicated to what they called unconventional investigative methods. The foundation employed former law enforcement, psychologists, and people with abilities they described as enhanced perception of transitional states. In less coded language, they employed people who could communicate with the dead, who could serve as intermediaries between the living world and whatever came after. "They're always looking for dispatchers," Linda explained. "People who've been trained to stay calm under pressure, to extract information from distressed callers, to coordinate responses to emergencies. Those skills translate well to working with souls who are trying to communicate across the barrier. You'd be helping people, both the living and the dead, but without the burden of trying to maintain a normal dispatch job while also operating as a medium." She slid her business card across the desk with a phone number written on the back. "Think about it. Take some time. But if you decide you want to use this ability to help rather than running from it, give them a call. Tell them I referred you." I took the folder and card, thanked Linda for everything, and walked out of the dispatch center for what I thought would be the last time. My resignation was processed quickly, my security clearance revoked, my access to the system terminated within hours. I was officially no longer a 911 dispatcher, no longer part of the infrastructure that connected people in crisis with emergency services. But the calls didn't stop. They followed me home, came through my personal cell phone, even came through phones that weren't mine when I was near them. I'd be in a coffee shop and the payphone on the wall would ring, and I'd know before answering that it would be someone calling from the other side with information or messages or just the need to be heard. The ability, once awakened, apparently didn't turn off just because I'd quit my job. I was stuck hearing voices from the dead, whether I wanted to or not, whether I was being paid to help them or not. After a week of constant calls, of barely sleeping, of trying to help souls that I had no official authority or resources to assist, I called the number Linda had given me. The Threshold Foundation operated out of an unmarked office building in the industrial district, the kind of place that looked like it housed accounting firms or small manufacturing operations, rather than an organization dedicated to communicating with the dead. I met with their director, a woman named Dr. Cassandra Voss, who had the calm, unshakable demeanor of someone who'd seen things that would break most people and had made peace with it. She explained that the foundation had been operating for 30 years, had started when a group of bereaved families realized that traditional investigation methods were failing to find their missing loved ones and began exploring alternatives. They'd discovered through trial and error that certain individuals could perceive information that existed outside normal sensory channels, could communicate with consciousness that had survived physical death, could access knowledge that shouldn't be accessible. "We're not spiritualists or psychics," Dr. Voss clarified. We don't do seances or crystal balls or any of that theatrical nonsense. We work with people who have a genuine ability to perceive and communicate across the barrier between life and death, and we use that ability to solve real problems, to find missing people, to bring closure to families, to prevent future crimes when souls provide warning information about living perpetrators. She showed me case files spanning decades, missing persons found because a deceased victim had called through to a Foundation operator and provided location details. Cold cases solved because murder victims had identified their killers from beyond the grave. Even a few crimes prevented because souls had warned about living people who were planning violence. The success rate was impressive, though Dr. Voss acknowledged that the work was psychologically taxing and that burnout was common. Most of our operators last 2 to 3 years before they need to step back. The constant exposure to death, to tragedy, to the desperation of souls who have unfinished business, it takes a toll that most people can't sustain indefinitely. But for those years, they make a real difference. They help people on both sides of the barrier in ways that no one else can. She offered me a position as an operator, explaining that the pay was modest, but the work was meaningful, that I'd have access to resources and support that I wouldn't have trying to help souls on my own, that I'd be part of a team of people who understood what I was experiencing because they were experiencing it too. I accepted, knowing that I'd never be able to return to a normal life, that once you could hear the dead calling, you had a responsibility to answer. That was 6 months ago, and I've been working as a Threshold Foundation operator ever since, taking calls from souls who need help, who have information to share, who just need someone to acknowledge their existence one final time before fully transitioning. The work is exactly as exhausting and heartbreaking as Dr. Voss warned, but it's also meaningful in ways I never experienced during my decade as a regular dispatcher. I've helped find missing children, identified serial killers who were operating undetected, prevented suicides by passing along messages from deceased loved ones who wanted to tell the living not to follow them into death. I've learned that the boundary between life and death is far more permeable than most people realize, that consciousness survives physical death in some form, and that the living and the dead are constantly trying to communicate across a barrier that's thinner in some places than others. The 911 system, with its specific frequency and universal recognition, is one of those thin places, a portal that works in both directions when the conditions are right and when the living person on the other end is able to hear what's being transmitted. But I've also learned something darker that keeps me awake at night and makes me question whether answering these calls is ultimately helping or making things worse. The operators, the entities that facilitate transitions between life and death, they're not neutral intermediaries. They have their own agenda, their own reasons for allowing certain souls to make calls while blocking others, for connecting specific dispatchers with specific dead callers. Dr. Voss and the other Foundation members don't fully understand what the operators are or what they want, but they've noticed patterns that suggest the calls aren't random, that information is being strategically released to influence events in the living world, that we're all being manipulated by something that exists outside our normal understanding of reality. Some calls seem designed to solve crimes or bring closure, but others seem designed to sow chaos, to direct attention toward certain people or events while distracting from others, to create outcomes that serve purposes we can't perceive from our limited perspective. The calls are also increasing in frequency and intensity, exactly as my father warned in his final message. We're receiving more calls from souls who died violently, who have warnings about living people planning mass casualties, who claim to see patterns from their perspective that indicate something catastrophic is approaching. The operators are losing control of the system, or possibly allowing the system to fail for reasons of their own. And the result is that the boundary between the living and the dead is deteriorating. We're seeing evidence of this deterioration everywhere. More people reporting encounters with deceased loved ones, more electronic voice phenomena captured on recording devices, more children claiming to remember past lives or see people who aren't there. The veil is thinning, and nobody knows what will happen when it finally tears completely, when the dead can communicate with the living without needing phone systems or mediums, when the two worlds that have been carefully separated for all of human history suddenly collapse into each other. Last night, I received a call that made me understand why I needed to quit. Not just the 911 dispatch center, but the Foundation, this work, this responsibility entirely. The caller was me, or rather, a version of me that was calling from some point in my own future after I'd died. My own voice came through the phone, older and tired but unmistakably mine, speaking with that same calm acceptance I'd heard in every other dead caller. Hey, it's you, or me, or however this works. I'm calling to warn you that you need to stop answering these calls. The operators, they're not facilitating transitions, they're farming us. Every soul that calls through the system, every message that gets transmitted, it feeds them somehow. They're using our desperate need to communicate, our unfinished business, our love for the people we left behind, and they're converting it into something they can consume. The more souls that call, the stronger they become, and they're getting ready to cross over themselves, to manifest in the physical world, using all the energy they've harvested from millions of dead callers over decades. My future self continued. explaining that the catastrophe the other souls had been warning about wasn't a natural disaster or human conflict, but something far worse. The operators preparing to breach the barrier and establish themselves permanently in the living world, using the 911 system and other communication networks as anchor points for their manifestation. Every call you answer, every soul you help, you're feeding the system that's going to destroy the boundary between life and death. I know you think you're helping, that you're making a difference, but you're actually accelerating the collapse. The only way to slow it down, maybe prevent it entirely, is to stop. Stop answering the calls, stop working for the Foundation, convince others to stop too. Let the souls move on without trying to communicate back. Let the operators starve for the energy they need to cross over. It's the only chance we have. The call ended with my future dead self giving me specific instructions about how to shut down the Foundation's operations, how to disable the amplification equipment they use to enhance operators' abilities, how to sever the connections that had been carefully built over 30 years of helping the dead communicate with the living. I sat with that information for hours after the call ended, trying to decide if I believed my own future voice, if this was a genuine warning or some kind of trick by the operators to stop us from helping souls that genuinely needed assistance. But the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. Every religion and spiritual tradition had warnings about communing with the dead, about opening doorways that should stay closed, about entities that could cross over if given enough energy or invitation. We'd dismissed those warnings as superstition, had convinced ourselves that we were different, that we understood what we were doing and could control it. But maybe the warnings were right all along. Maybe the barrier between life and death existed for a reason, and by weakening it, we were inviting something terrible into our world. So I'm quitting. Not just my job, but this entire endeavor. This belief that we can help both the living and the dead by facilitating communication between them. I'm going to disappear, change my name, move somewhere remote, turn off my phone, and disconnect from all networks that could be used to reach me. And I'm writing this down, posting it online, hoping that someone else who can hear the dead will read it and make the same choice. That enough of us will stop answering, that the system will shut down before it's too late. If you work in 911 dispatch, if you've been hearing voices that report their own deaths, if you've received calls that seemed impossible but turned out to be accurate, please stop answering. Please quit, walk away, refuse to be part of this system anymore. The souls calling aren't just lost people trying to find closure. They're food for something ancient and hungry that's been waiting for us to open the door wide enough for it to come through. Every call you answer brings that day closer. Every message you pass along gives them more energy. Every connection you facilitate strengthens their ability to manifest. I know it feels like you're helping, like you're making a difference, like you're using a gift to ease suffering, but you're not. You're feeding monsters that have been pretending to be helpers. And when they finally cross over completely, when the barrier falls and the dead flood back into the living world, we'll understand too late what we've done. I've been a 911 dispatcher for 10 years, and last night I got a call that made me quit forever. I'm begging you to quit too, before we all pay the price for our good intentions and our inability to leave the dead alone to finish their journey without dragging us along with them. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.